Welcome to the WorkWell Podcast. I'm Dulcie, and I'm here with my best friend of over 20 years, Yemisi.
20 years? Wow. And in that time, we've seen it all professionally. From big wins to epic fails, we've learned so much along the way about life, work, and everything in between.
We don't believe in gatekeeping, so we want to share these lessons with you. We've created this space to explore the challenges we all face, whether it's finding balance, building confidence, or even stepping into leadership.
You'll get stories, advice, and practical tools to help you feel inspired, informed, and excited to tackle whatever comes next.
So, take a deep breath, settle in, and let's dive into today's conversation. Welcome back to the WorkWell Podcast. As we wrap up this season, we are diving into a topic that's been woven throughout all of our episodes. Yes, it's mental health and the connection it has to work and life.
Absolutely, Dulcie. Today, we are thrilled to have Phil Shaw, a psychotherapist and mental health advocate, join us for a deep dive into how to maintain good mental well-being, better understand therapy, and take those first steps towards seeking help. But before we get started, Phil, could you please tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do?
I would absolutely love to. And I just want to start by saying thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
Thank you for coming.
I am a very big fan of what you're both doing. And just really excited to have this conversation with you because I think it's an important one. I mean, in terms of who I am and some of the work I do. So as you mentioned, I'm a psychotherapist and counsellor. And I'm also a co-founder of Room for Therapy, which is a therapy agency based in Edinburgh. But we work nationally. I've always been passionate about how people emotionally engage and experience their world. But I think it's maybe worth saying that prior to training as a therapist, I had a few other careers that are very much linked into some of the things I suspect we might talk about today, all of which had a common root around understanding human experience, but then using it in slightly different ways. So originally, I trained as an actor, and then I retrained as an anthropologist. Yeah, I've spent many years then working across big companies as a business anthropologist specifically. And during that time, I just became really fascinated by the impact that work and work environments can have on individuals' mental and emotional well-being. And with that, often their sense of self, so their sense of who they are. The more I expanded my work or an employee experience, the more I felt sort of a burning need to build out my knowledge and understand a bit more sort of deeply around the experiences that some people have and how to support those experiences. And that really took me towards therapy.
That's such an interesting journey that you've been on, from acting to anthropology to what you're doing now. That's incredible. But it's so clear that there's this real desire to understand people.
Yeah, I feel like that's just always been something that is completely fascinating to me. And I think, very much akin to the work that you do and that you're exploring. I think that work, I mean, it's a place that we spend a third of our lives. It has such a huge impact on not only how we experience and make meaning about our world, but definitely the way that we think about ourselves. So I feel like, yes, mental health, emotional well-being, and the workplace, it's really worth thinking about the relationships between all of them.
Absolutely. Wowza. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm so excited to have you with us today and to just get your perspective on all of this stuff. So for everyone listening, by the end of this episode, I think what you're going to be able to walk away with is a clearer understanding of what therapy is.
Yeah.
In fact, what mental health is, because I think we bandied that term around a lot, but actually let's really dive into what it really means. And of course, how life and work intertwine and impact that. So let's get started. Okay, so for those who might be new to the idea of therapy, Phil, can you explain what it involves and the impact that it can have?
Yeah, sure thing. So I feel like I should start by saying that therapy is a very broad topic, and I cannot speak on behalf of all therapists through time. But in terms of my understanding of it, I wonder if it's helpful to start from a place of thinking about why people attend therapy. And yeah, for me, we are all clearly, we are meaning makers. As human beings, it is integral to our existence that we make meaning in order that we feel safe and we understand what's going on in our world.
I really love this phrase, we are meaning makers. I love that.
Yeah.
I'm going to use that all the time.
Me too. But in terms of therapy, and kind of taking that phrase a little bit further, for me, therapy is about having a space and a really emotionally safe and healthy environment in which to make more productive meaning about the experiences that we've had. So quite often, whether it's through developing defenses or, actually, and when I say defenses there, I mean tactics or ways of thinking through and processing that are really important and valid given the circumstances we're in. We work out ways to navigate our world, but sometimes as our world changes or as our circumstances change, we hold on to old defenses. We hold on to old ways of doing things and making meaning that aren't necessarily productive or helping us or serving us anymore.
I'm starting to feel like you're just talking directly to me,
I was like looking for the hidden cameras in my brain.
But yeah, so therapy specifically I believe, is for people who have got so far in their meaning-making process, but maybe are stuck, maybe can't go much further and feel that they want some additional help or support in either pushing beyond the meaning that they've made or making different meaning that, as I say, is more productive. So it's really about entering into a relationship in which a professional is able to meet you in your experience, support you in that, and walk alongside you while you do this different form of meaning-making. And in that respect, it feels as important to say as well, it's very much a facilitation of your process. We may dig into this a little bit further, but a lot of people have this misconception that therapy is an advice service. I can't tell you the number of people who, when I first meet them in session, they will sit down and sort of say, hey, this is what I want. I want you to tell me what to do. I want you to give me the answers. And there are contexts in which maybe that would happen, probably not therapeutic context. But for me, there is so much more meaning and more value in actually getting someone to run their own process and for me to support that process in order that they both think through and feel through their experiences and get to a place of deeper understanding that is truly their own. Whereas if I just give them the answers, they might not be the answers that they would have got to, organically.
Right. I was just absorbing that. That was just really interesting because the way Hollywood has portrayed therapy is that kind of you lie on someone's couch and you're like, oh yeah, doc, this is what I'm going through. And then they are meant to psychoanalyze you and come up with some kind of solution to your problem. But the way you've described it, Phil, is very much people-centered and less kind of, observational and more getting into the murky waters with you and helping you figure things out, but without being in the driving seat, so to speak. So yeah, I was blown away by that.
Can I say, you just touched on a couple of points there that feel so pertinent and really interesting as well to explore. One of them is around the way that therapy is typically depicted. Like, I'm so glad that you've invited me to do a bit of defining here, because if we sort of think across how we are shown therapy, I mean, it's kind of fascinating in that it's a very confidential process. And therefore, we don't really have sight into what actual therapy practices look like. And instead, we get given this very kind of often glamorized or kind of heightened extreme version within film, TV, media. I'm thinking about, say, I don't know, Annalise Keating in The Hypnose Murder. It's always this kind of very glamorous setting, like some gorgeous apartment in LA. And some very high octane, extreme scenario that's being brought. And usually the therapist is being very directive or asking questions that frankly are completely inappropriate. But let's be real, like that's often for the purpose of drama, And I get that. I get that in terms of, show writers want to have a pretty exciting, compelling plot going on. But it does mean that the view we get of it is often quite extreme and quite, I'd say, manipulated into something that it isn't. I mean, even just the idea that therapy, it can be about looking at a specific problem, but it's not always about crisis. It can very much be about, people wanting to grow. It can be about self-growth in the same way that you might go to, a personal trainer to work on your body. There are so many reasons why you could use it. So yeah, I love what you've called out there.
Thank you so much, Phil. And following on from that, finding the right therapist can feel really daunting. What advice would you give someone starting that search?
Yeah, so this is a fantastic question because it's really difficult. I feel like if you were to ask a general collective of the population, how do you find a therapist? A lot of people aren't very sure. I think, and that comes down to quite a lot of different factors. Like, firstly, again, there's this sense of actually not knowing sort of also where are therapists located? Like, where do they exist? We know that, for example, if we want to see a GP, we'll go to a doctor's surgery. But there are lots of different spaces in which therapy operates and therapists function. So I'd say if you are looking to find a therapist, one of the best ways to do that is through recommendation. If you know that someone has already found someone and works with them, That can be a really great way to know that someone is credible or maybe worth working with. The only challenge to that is that as part of therapeutic practice, it's not advised to work with anyone who already has a connection to someone you know. So it would probably have to be like a friend of a friend type thing.
Right.
But in terms of practicalities and where to look, I'd say there are probably the easiest way to do it is to look at directories. So there are several big directories. I'm thinking things like the Counselling Directory, Psychology Today, some really big directories within the UK that basically list with photo and a bit of a description all of the registered therapists across the country. The challenge that you then have, though, is that therapists often practice with different modalities. So by that, I mean they have a slightly different approach. I work, for example, in a psychodynamic and a person-centered way. So psychodynamic is about looking into someone's past and thinking about the ways in which their historic past might be reoccurring in their present, whereas person-centered is a way of being alongside someone. So it's very much calling upon empathy, thinking about the way that I show up in the relationship operates in the room, and how that kind of offers a really live opportunity to think and feel through certain things. So yeah, you want to explore modalities. And I would say, like, throughout all of the things I'm going to list here, if you're unsure about what these things mean or you want more information, any good therapist should be able to tell you. So you should just ask them. Like, just ask them about, how they practice and what that looks like, how that might show up or be as an experience for you as a client. Beyond that, you also want to think about qualifications. So the reason I say that with that slight tone is because therapy is an unusual industry in that it is not regulated in terms of, you can practice without any qualifications, and that's technically legal, which is worrying. And absolutely
Really worrying.
It is very worrying. But yeah, what does exist, however, are membership bodies. So someone will have had to do quite a significant degree of training, so several years, in order to qualify to be part of a membership body. So you can see, for example, on their profiles, whether they are members of, say, like BACP or COSCA or varying membership bodies. And if you see that, that means that they are credible to an extent of qualification. Beyond that, you want to obviously take into account connection. So what are the vibes like? How do you actually connect to that person? Because that's major. You're about to go on this journey with that person that can be very emotive and sometimes vulnerable making. So you want to feel like there's a degree of trust and that they just feel like a person that you are willing to step into that with.
And if the vibes aren't there, if you're not quite gelling, how do you broach that? If you feel like this isn't working, is there a best way to sort of move on?
So that is a great question. I would say personally, with all of these things, bring it to your therapist. And by that, I mean, talk to them about it. Offer that up. And it may well be that they're feeling the same thing and that you can talk about it, and either you get beyond it, it's something that you can work out, or perhaps it's just not going to work. But I would really strongly advise across so many of these different elements that you take it to the therapist that you're seeing and you question them around it. Again, a therapist who's worth their salt will not only be totally willing to have that conversation, but will probably find that very helpful in terms of how they support you more effectively. But apart from that, I would say if it doesn't feel like the right fit, keep trying with other people. Try out a few different therapists and see what works for you. And then beyond that, I'd say cost is definitely a factor. Different therapists will charge differing amounts, and clearly that needs to align with your budget, but it also needs to align with your sense of value. Some therapists, for example, will offer completely free therapy. And I do have a bit of a question mark around that, on the basis that I think there's something quite powerful and important about feeling like you are having a value exchange, like there is value in the work and you're acknowledging that by paying something for it. Yeah. But there are lots of different services that offer sort of differing tiers of cost. So if that is a challenge for you, maybe try and find a pay what you can service, for example. And then ultimately, there's also the consideration of, do you want in-person or online therapy? And that could be relative to a lot of different factors. That many therapists offer both. With in-person, of course, you want to be in the same city or relatively local to that person physically. So there are quite a few different factors, and I appreciate that can make it challenging. I guess all I can really say on that is finding the right person who is able to support you in the way that you need to be supported is very much worth it.
That was amazing, Phil. Thank you so much. I think that's going to be incredible. It's helpful for me actually thinking about getting back into therapy and how to start looking again. So yeah, really, really appreciate all that advice. Maybe it's taking a step back, and we talked about this in the intro, it's this phrase mental health. And it might feel like a bit of a silly question, but what does it actually mean?
Yeah, so I think that beginning with definitions is really helpful. I'm glad you're asking this question. So for me, mental health, I don't love the term. And the reason I say that is because I think it needs to be a little bit more holistic. And that, yeah, for me, certainly the work I do, it's not just about mental health. It's very much around what I would term emotional well-being. And the distinction I'm kind of making there is I think that when we go to a place of talking about mental health, there tends to be kind of an assumption there that it's about mental health being in a bad way, like that someone is really not well.
Yeah.
It's a place of wellness, but in quite an extreme sense, I feel.
So like the idea that therapy is only for people in crisis.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we're going to break it down in, I guess quite an extreme way, if we describe someone as being mental, it sounds like they are experiencing some form of madness. But also health is very medical to my mind. And as I said, like this is not simply about illness. Instead, to use a really therapeutic term, we think in terms of congruence. So by that, I mean, congruence is kind of about basically our inner and our outer worlds matching and the different parts of ourselves feeling aligned and coherent. And it's often at times when that's not really the case that we feel uncomfortable. There is a jarring, there's a discomfort that is difficult to live with.
Okay, so I've got another phrase from you. We've had meaning makers, and now we've got congruence. I am loving this.
Yeah, but I think by aligning it with a medical model, going to this mental health place, it also has connotations of power that I don't. And I say that because I think, and maybe this is slightly anecdotal, but I'm thinking about lots of experiences I've had interacting with medical professionals. I feel like they are very much positioned as the expert. And I am often this, foolish muppet who needs help with my sore throat or whatever it is. Whereas actually in a therapeutic context, power is something we work with really quite explicitly. And there's a lot of care and time taken to try and shift away from a power over model in which we appear as experts, because that can be really unhelpful when someone is feeling vulnerable and needs support. So yeah, there are quite a few elements I don't really like there. Yeah, I'll say that much.
So we should be thinking more about emotional well-being.
Yes. Yeah, or certainly including that. Because as I mentioned earlier, people come to therapy for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes it is to work through a particular difficulty or an experience that's been really challenging. But a lot of the time, it's because they just want to work on themselves and come closer into relationship with who they are and gain greater self-awareness.
So when it comes to this thing around this term mental health, and I'm so agree with you in the way in which we have used it interchangeably with someone who is going through a crisis. What else do people often say, or what are some common myths that you've encountered when it comes to mental health, mental well-being, therapy?
Oh my goodness. I could go on for a long time. Because again, like this comes back to the fact that particularly therapy, we don't often have a very real or honest insight into what it looks like in practice. Usually we've taken our view of it from quite extreme media or film examples. So I'd say some of the most common myths that we get, that you have to be unwell to go to therapy, that you'll be in therapy forever if you start it, that going to therapy means that you're weak, that people will find out that you're going to therapy and that that's a risk. Also, that therapists will tell you what to do. I mentioned earlier the expectation sometimes that it will be advice or they'll get given answers. But also this sense that therapy is a last resort, that it's something that you go to when everything else is awful. And a big part of the work that we do at Room for Therapy at the moment is around demystifying therapy. And that very much includes busting some of these myths.
Yeah, that's really important work that you're doing there, because you were going through the list of myths and I was like, I'm guilty of a few of these. So yeah, it's good to get that clarification. So mental health is something that impacts everyone differently. We know this. How do you then see personal and professional challenges overlapping in the clients that you work with?
So I guess I'm going to be cheeky and turn this one round as a question for you both. I can hear you smirking. I'm wondering, how would you say you divide the personal and the professional within a person?
I think they're interlinked, aren't they? Your professional life involves you. So there'll be how you show up to work or how you're able to show up in your professional life will have a very big impact on your overall well-being. So if you're not if you're not well personally, or you're not aligned, I should say, there's no congruence in your personal circumstances, then it will definitely affect your professional life in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I agree. I think this reminds me of our first episode. I'm not plugging, but go back and read one. But we talked about work-life balance versus work-life integration. And I think where we got to was that you are one person. And actually, and for, I think both of us, we talked about where we've struggled is when we're trying to be two people.
Yes.
Trying to be the real life person and the work person. And actually, it's when we're able to find a way to integrate that and show up as ourselves. And yes, of course, you appear differently in different settings, right? The context and what's appropriate, but you aren't changing who you are. You're actually finding a way to bring harmony between work and life. I suppose that's what WorkWell is all about, is that harmony between work and life. So I think, yeah, certainly from my perspective, struggle comes from that lack of congruence and
I love that word,
conflict between trying to be a different person in different settings. So
yeah, so I would strongly agree with both of you. It wasn't a trick question.
So what? And we fell into it.
We fell right into it.
Well, listen, for a trap, you answered it beautifully. From my side, as I say, I agree wholeheartedly. I think it's really difficult for us to divide these two apart as if the personal and the professional exist independently of each other. I mean, I'm sure we could have probably a pretty interesting conversation about some recent rhetoric around this in terms of, ideas like bring your whole self to work. A term that I'm not a big fan of because I think it's actually very difficult for people to do. But in terms of the kind of internal experience that an individual has when they are at work, yeah, like they are a whole person, and part of what they bring to work is everything from outside. To develop on the idea of congruence a little bit, and like a comparison that I think is really helpful in understanding that term is thinking about the difference between what I would say is congruence versus transparency. So for me, congruence is all about, as I say, being very honestly connected to what's really happening within us. Thinking about, even in terms of gut feel, for example, like how we're feeling, how we're emotionally responding to things, and just holding that awareness. That doesn't mean necessarily vocalizing it to everyone around us. It's not necessarily about being transparent in that way, but it's from a stance of self-awareness. It's very much about being in touch with where we are and why. So I would say, yeah, in a professional setting, the personal is still very much present. It maybe feels not entirely safe for everyone or advisable for everyone to be completely transparent all the time. But I would certainly say as well, just in addition to this, in terms of the work I do in my one-to-one practice with clients, one of the things I find fascinating is that often the first thing that a client brings, that a person comes to therapy with, is not the thing we stay with. We often will start with a particular, experience or issue that they want to think through, and we'll move into something else. So across the work with clients, I rarely do work with anyone in which their professional work doesn't factor at some point.
Okay, so something that Yemi and I have been talking about recently on the podcast is workplace dynamics and just exploring different things that seem to happen a lot, whether it's this het to threat or glass ceiling, whatever it might be. And something that came up again and again and again was equality and equity. And I feel, it feels like saying DEI now. It feels like you're ringing this bell. Like every time you say it, an angel dies or something. But we've talked a lot about these typical dynamics and the inequity of it all, and how that often will affect people's mental health. And like, I don't mind saying, we've said it on the podcast already, for both of us, we've been in a situation where it's definitely affected our mental health as two Black women. So in your sort of in your experience with what you're seeing, how do systemic issues like discrimination, like inequity, impact people's mental health?
I mean, this feels like such a topical and timely question, in that not only do I think this is generally just so important on the basis that how any individual experiences their mental health is so personal. And if they're going to have any kind of support, the support will end up being fairly unique in terms of if it's a relationship between two individuals. It should never be one size fits all in that respect. Going back to your question specifically around how systemic issues around discrimination or inequity come into play here, I think this has always been very relevant, but in some ways I feel like this is even more pertinent right now on the basis that there are so many different types of diversity that are being flagged as being, really demanding and needing of quite bespoke mental health provision.
Oh.
And we know already that where people feel compromised or feel like there's a lack of belonging, there is greater risk. So of course, this is going to impact whether it's minority or diverse groups.
Yeah.
I mean, just to run through some specific examples that I'm sure will feel very familiar and common in terms of the way that workplaces are being talked about. There's been a huge surge, for example, in recent years around discussing neurodivergence.
Yeah.
And we know now that 20% of the workforce is thought to be made up of people who are either dyslexic, dyscalculus, autism, ADHD, dyspraxia, that sit on the neurodivergent scale on the spectrum. And yet this collective, until recently, have been pretty much entirely overlooked, but they are at higher risk of anxiety and depression because of, issues like exclusion, bullying, and the stress of just navigating a work world that is designed for neurotypical people. So there's a huge need for specific address of their experience, including mental health provision. I'm very mindful that we're having this conversation as two Black women and a white gay man. But when it comes to race, for example, we know that in recent years, there has been a lot more attention and a lot more dialogue, largely in response to, for example, the George Floyd murder and other high profile acts of racial violence. But that in and of itself has been shown to have triggered quite a lot, like a significant increase in depression and anxiety among Black Americans, but also just Black communities internationally. And I think that's something that I have witnessed and found really problematic in all of that is that while these conversations, in aid of awareness generation have happened, a lot of people have expressed, particularly, Black colleagues, that there has been a lack of follow-up or...
so much of it is performative.
Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I definitely found that, obviously, what happened with George Floyd was terrible. Again, as a Black person, this wasn't the first time. We've been seeing this for a really long time. And I was thankful that for some reason, and perhaps it was because of the pandemic, because we weren't as busy in our day-to-day lives, for once this thing wasn't overlooked, and it was such a moment in history, which I was incredibly grateful for, but I was already cynical from day one.
Yes.
I was worried the black squares and all the things. I was like, is this just what people are trying to do to flag, like, hey, I'm not like those cops. I'm not that. I don't agree with it. But there's more to it than just not agreeing with it. Everybody, whether it doesn't even matter if it's not just a white people thing, this is an everybody thing of what are we doing? What actions are we going to take to start making society, community more equal, to bring equity into our day-to-day lives at every single level? It's not just a government thing or a business from the top saying, we're going to do this. What are we doing? Are we catching our microaggressions? Are we catching the eye rolls? Are we catching even the smallest things? No, not really. We're just posting things up to try and wash our hands of association or guilt or whatever, but actually not addressing what we're all doing in our day-to-day lives. And over time, I started hearing this phrase, allyship fatigue, and it was inevitable, right? I think we've always seen, like, with the people have the best intentions, the best will in the world, but actually changing behavior and changing mindsets, and that's so much harder. Yeah. And actually, is there really that drive to make those changes, or even not necessarily the drive? Are there the tools to do it? Do people know, if I wanted to be anti-racist, because that's a very specific thing, how do I go about addressing that? How do I review myself? How do I, if I see something in my family, if somebody said, my grandmother says something racist, how do I challenge her with love? I don't think there's enough practical support for people to make real change. And so over time, it just starts to become a bit annoying. I'm like, okay, we're tired of hearing about this, And you get into a situation like the world we're seeing around us now, where it's just all falling to pieces because it was driven by shame and guilt, not by a real
desire for transformation. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I'll jump off my soapbox.
No, I agree 100% with everything you said, Dulcie.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think for me, like, certainly from a therapeutic standpoint, whilst it can be really helpful and genuinely therapeutic to allow people a space to be heard and to be listened to, and for that to feel like it has been in some way received, what can then be very damaging is when it gets dropped, when it feels like it has been dropped. And I think there's a really interesting challenge in here around what is reasonable for different people to be responsible for. And I think trying to be responsible for experiences that are not your own and you therefore can never really fully understand is problematic, but also often quite ego-driven.
That's when you get that white savior complex coming.
Yeah. Whereas I think there's something, for me, there's a different lens that can be applied, which is all about the promotion of the other's agency. In terms of how do you bring people whose experiences are at play here closer to the decision making? And that's a different angle.
Yeah.
If you as a leader, for example, in business are feeling like you are flailing or you don't know, or you have this responsibility to manage any group or collective of identity that you do not have experience of personally, in terms of it's not your own, I think you need to ask a question about, well, why do you think you can do that? And who could do that? Who could not only understand from a place of understanding, but represent and do some more decision making if you empower them to do that.
Amazing.
So racially, there is still, I mean, there's been for an incredibly long time an issue, but I think that given recent years and the way that a lot of people are feeling like, some of the awareness generation has led to a bit of a standstill. That feels like a burning issue for me. In addition, I mean, I've kind of named gender even between us on this call.
Yeah.
I think clearly like gender inequality and gender parity have been issues for a really long time when it comes to thinking about male and female, or men and women rather. But I think that we're definitely at a point in history sociopolitically where expressions of gender identity are really evolving. We've got more individuals now openly identifying as non-binary, transgender, or gender diverse than we've ever had before. I think the last stats I saw are that in the UK, we've got about 12% of 16 to 17-year-olds and 9% of 18 to 24-year-olds identifying as non-binary.
Wow,
which is
I didn't know that.
Which is a pretty significant, portion of the population to be catering for. And similarly, when it comes to, say, transgender identity, that's risen by 5-fold since 2000.
Right.
So this is really, I mean, it's important anyway, but I think it's just completely undeniable as a need that there needs to be quite a specific address and thinking put against how we cater to the mental health issues and the emotional well-being of those collectives. And I say that because in their case, for example, I mean, we know that discrimination is widespread. We don't need to look very far to see, particularly certain political agendas to use some of these groups as a really quite extraordinary punching bag.
Yeah.
And yeah, it won't surprise you to hear that, of course, that leads to social stress, to feelings of unacceptance, to an increased risk of mental health struggle. But again, work systems and settings aren't typically designed for them. So I think that's another key factor. And then...
Sorry, just on that, I think that's so interesting, thinking about work and thinking about managing, because, what was it, 12% of 16 to 17-year-olds, 9% 18 to 24-year-olds are non-binary. But I think thinking as for managers and leaders, that's your future workforce, right? You can't ignore it. You need to lean into understanding and how we as leaders can shift these work systems to make it safe for everybody to thrive in them. So I think that's a really interesting one to think about. This is the future of the workforce we're talking about as well.
Yeah. Completely and absolutely agree. I guess another thing that feels really important to flag on this is it can be tempting as well to talk about some of these components of identity as if they are very separate and distinct cases. But there's a lot of crossover. Like a lot of people will be experiencing multiple forms of identity in this sense, and of difference, and then therefore inequality. I mean, particularly the crossover between LGBT, including non-binary identity, and neurodiversity is absolutely huge. Absolutely huge. very significant. So yeah, these are not isolated cases. But I feel like, Dulcie, you're also now starting to speak to something that feels like a further form of maybe less obvious diversity. And that is around age. And I feel like this doesn't get talked about that much, but, for the first time in history, we're within a period now of time in which 5 generations are working side by side.
Retirement?
Yeah.
What's that?
Yeah. Well, precisely. Like, few people can. And yeah, I was seeing as well, again, in terms of some recent research, according to the American Psychological Association, 92% of employees now say that it's very or somewhat important to them for a work organization to have values around emotional and psychological well-being. So not only do we have this very, very diverse collective in terms of age, all of whom have very differing experiences, I suspect, of how they relate to themselves emotionally, how they relate to things like therapy or, terms like mental health, very, very different. But across the board, there's a huge, and I think an increasing demand and an awareness of the need for emotional and psychological well-being. So it's there, but my goodness, there is a lot of diversity, and the diversity ultimately demands, very different treatment and consideration.
So you're going to be pretty busy, Phil.
Do you know, I would honestly say it's never a dull day.
Okay, so who would you say is responsible for mental health at work? And don't say I should answer that question.
Oh my gosh. Yeah,
no more traps.
No more traps.
I would love to turn this one around because this is a really tough question. I think that for a huge amount of the time, there is a bit of a temptation to be looking upwards and to be expecting that leaders should be managing all of this. And I guess my challenge here is I don't think it is actually fair to pin this on leaders. I mean, and I say that from multiple angles. For starters, most leaders have ended up in a position of leadership because they are either technically very good at the skills that are required for a role, or because they have maintained a loyalty to a company and therefore through tenure have worked through the ranks. What I have very rarely seen are leaders who have ended up in their role on the basis of how good they are at managing the emotional and mental well-being of their employees.
Yeah.
That is not usually something that is assessed or considered, frankly, within progression and promotion pathways. And similarly, I'd say leaders cannot pin all the responsibility on themselves because given that they are not mental health professionals, it's unrealistic to expect that they would know how to manage some of the difficulties that might come up for various colleagues. And I think that us putting that expectation on them or them putting that expectation on themselves can and does lead to some really, really problematic situations. This for me actually also flags as a slight tangent. I'm really fascinated by the conflux that we've had over the last 10 years within businesses of what are often termed mental health champions. And this is a term that I get a little bit concerned around or a little bit antsy around. In that what I'm meaning by this, and I've certainly seen this across a lot of really large companies, are individuals who have often nominated as people who've had experiences of challenging mental health and therefore are being positioned as those who can now help. And where I find this problematic is, say, for example, I break my arm and I am then, a qualified doctor, surgeon, say, fixes me up, sorts me out. Then I meet someone who has got a broken arm. Why on earth would I be qualified because I've broken my arm? But I don't think it is thought through in that way within the context of mental and emotional well-being. Just because we have experienced something difficult does not mean that we are in a position to safely facilitate someone else through that process. Having trained in this for many years, I can guarantee you that what I do now versus how I might have tried to do it many years ago is extremely different. And it does worry me that a lot of position, and as I say, not just position, but put that responsibility, that onus on someone else to be looking after the mental well-being of other people. So I think in that sense, I think there's too much expectation on it being a top-down thing. And also that top-down thing, to throw some more fuel on the fire, it often means that we kind of actually exclude the possibility that leaders themselves are struggling.
Yes.
So that top-down thing is a problem. But also that top-down model, I think, completely deletes the agency of people who are not at the top a lot of the time.
Yeah.
So for me, yeah, it can't be just top down and it can't be just bottom up. It has to be a bit of a combination of the two. And depending on the company, the size of the company, the nature of the industry, unfortunately, my answer is a bit of it depends. Like it is relative to where you are. But yeah, I think responsibility is so important to be thinking about. And I guess ultimately, not that I'm, just self-promoting here, I think there's huge merit in bringing in third parties on the basis they are separate from this greater being that is the business. They are not within the hierarchy. They are not necessarily caught up in the power models of that business. And as I'm saying that, something else that comes to mind, which I'm smiling before I even say it because I suspect it might resonate. I'm really quite alarmed by how often we see businesses being personified. Business will look after us as if it is this living, breathing, sentient being with an awareness and care for us.
Yeah, fairy godmother.
But also in the same way, and I'm sure you've talked about this before, but this idea of businesses being positioned as families.
Run, red flag. Run for your life.
But truly, where that is a real worry, aside the arguments that you would never hire or fire your children, for me, where there's a real worry is that these false expectations and hopes and senses of safety nets exist that are completely unrealistic or don't exist. And then when someone is really struggling, or if things do become really challenging, it can feel like it all falls away. And there's something very disorientating about that. So I think it's really serious and something that has to be considered.
It really is. And I think I remember a personal experience for me of being in a company where it really was positioned as like family, that was so part of the culture. And I think I've mentioned it before on the podcast about burning out and just hitting a wall. And it was in that place where I found out that I was being quite severely undervalued. But because there were so many things at play. There was just my own stuff about work was my entire identity. And this is, deep rooted from childhood type stuff, right? But also that I think I had fallen for it. The whole work family thing, and that there is this deeper care and we're all very much in this thing together, and actually finding out that I am just a number, I'm just a number on a spreadsheet somewhere, and me being undervalued in that way was just profit for the business ultimately, right? And it was crushing. So yeah, when you're talking about this personification of the business, it can be really dangerous. And it really affected my self-worth, my self-esteem. I'd be lying if I said I've totally worked through it. What year is this? 2025. So like 6 years later, I still feel a little bit there. But there's some real dangers to that.
Yeah. Completely. And I feel like, as you're saying that, it's sparking two things for me. One is you are quite directly now talking into, I think, historical relationships. And by that I mean, we all have history in terms of, with our primary caregivers, like we have had the experience of what it is to be cared for or isn't to be cared for in some people's cases. And therefore, if we go into a work context and we look at a business as if it is a parent, we are bringing quite a lot of historical expectation, but also sometimes historical wounds and challenge into that dynamic and basically projecting it into it with an expectation that that's how it will or should run. And that can be hugely, hugely problematic and actually quite damaging for us as an experience, and depending on what it is that we're bringing and how we view it. But I would say that for anyone who's listening to this and thinking, gosh, well, if it's not my family and I really like that idea, I think there can be something quite empowering about realizing that actually, whilst the system doesn't owe you anything, you also don't own it anything. You do not have to be anything in particular in order to win its love, because it will never love you. Like it's not capable of that.
Wow.
Can you say that again?
Yes, for the people at the back.
Yeah. Okay, everyone, listen to this.
So, as individuals, we do not need to win the love of the businesses we work for on the basis that businesses cannot love us back. They are not, as I said, sentient beings have an ability to love us back or to look after us in that way.
I might need to just go and lie down for a minute because that really got me.
But isn't it tempting? Isn't it tempting?
Yes, it is.
It really is.
Believe that, if we just show up in the right ways and if we just work hard enough and if we just give enough of ourselves and our care and our love, that a business will love us back. wake up. Like, nonsense. Nonsense. That's not possible. But I feel like it is a really, really common and quite dangerous narrative to fall into. The other thing that was coming up for me as well when you were talking, Dulcie, is a word that is so commonly used right now, and in a way that is totally incorrect a lot of the time, is trauma. Really cool when I hear people, referring to things as being, traumatic or triggering or whatever, in quite a sort of throwaway sense. I think it's useful to actually think about what we really mean by trauma. Because increasingly I'm seeing people having conversations or doing inquiries into organizational trauma. So for me, trauma is not just what happens or occurs when someone goes through an unpleasant experience or a difficult event. More specifically than that, it's when someone has a really challenging experience, but there is no witnessing of their emotional experience or what has happened for them emotionally. So they go unwitnessed through that difficulty. And that is when there is no space to process it, to feel through it, and to make sense of it. And that's when it often becomes internalized or then repeats and is ultimately a trauma, like something that stays with us in a problematic way. So I think for me, there is something in terms of going back to this question around who's responsible for mental health at work. I think if we consider how experiences could genuinely be traumatic within work, there is a really important question for us to ask around, well, who could be responsible for witnessing the difficulties that happen? And again, I'm not convinced that it has to be, or it can be leaders, certainly not all of the time and through all instances of challenge. But I think this is where, bringing in third parties or maybe even using therapeutic practice within businesses is something that is not only could be helpful, but is actually something that I think is needed.
It's essential, honestly. I'm feeling quite moved by this section here, Phil. Thank you again. This is just brilliant. We have learned so much, and I'm sure all the listeners have as well, have learned so much from this conversation so far. But this bit about what businesses can do, with the acknowledgement that it's not all their responsibility, right? But what can businesses learn from therapy to do the right thing for their people?
Okay, this feels like a great question, and it's maybe worth saying, like, slightly shameless plug, but as Room for Therapy, as an agency, we do work with businesses directly, and we have like quite a kind of clear sense of some of what we would term key components of therapeutic working can be taken directly into businesses and used to make businesses more emotionally healthy. So speaking to some of those immediately, I mean, one that comes to mind straight up, and again, it's probably a term that you will have heard, and there may be some eye rolling here, but it's the idea of psychological safety. Now, the reason I acknowledge that there might be some eye rolling here is my experience of working across businesses where this term gets used hasn't always been very positive. And by that, I mean, I quite often hear this being a term that is, for example, said at the beginning of a meeting in the hope that by saying it, it makes it so. But it's just the state that we're all suddenly within.
I have £1 million in my bank account. Done.
That's it. I'm like Naomi Campbell.
But yeah, I mean, psychological safety is something that can't just be said or named in therapy. It has to be established in order that you work with people. So in a therapeutic sense, we have a really clear and quite actionable way of actually making this happen. So for example, we have really clear-cut ethical codes. We have a really clear series of ways of working in terms of confidentiality. We have what's referred to as the therapeutic frame. So this idea that you have to maintain a level of consistency that's somewhat rigorous in terms of, you see people regularly at the same time for the same amount of time. You don't go over, you don't break that frame in that way. And that might sound quite intense, but actually what it does is, especially over time, it builds up a level of trust. It makes it credible what you're doing in order that, that in addition to continually creating a relationship that is not judgmental, people are able to enter that space and feel safe and feel that they can, mindfully work through whatever is difficult with honesty and vulnerability, and that growth can actually happen. So I'd say, can businesses learn something from that practice? Absolutely. As I say, what we're interested in doing as an agency is taking that into businesses in a way that it becomes tangible. So that there are actually clear-cut ways, as I mentioned, in which rather than just saying it, we can actually make it so. So I think psychological safety is a big one. Another one that is coming to mind as well is we talk in therapy quite a lot about the idea of the use of self. So by that, that's a slightly theoretical expression of it. But what I'm talking about really there is, as therapists, we work really hard over often years of personal therapy and personal development to really get to a place of self-awareness that enables us to engage without ego.
Yeah.
And it's in doing that work that, and often that work is tough. I'll own that. It's about exploring and confronting sometimes the parts of ourselves that we might struggle with, that we don't really want to look at.
Mm-hmm.
But by doing that and having a really clear sense of who we are more holistically, you are much better positioned to, as I say, not only operate without ego, but to own who you are and to make sure that you are operating with a real awareness of how things impact you and how you might have impact rather than slightly blindly bumbling through. And, provided that you're ticking the right boxes, etc., and you're being acknowledged for the right things, it doesn't really matter, how other people are experiencing you. So this is great when it comes to, for example, like collaboration or teaming with others. Self-awareness is pretty integral there. And that's something that we work with leaders on, we work with teams on. You can think about use of self, not just in terms of the individual, but in terms of team identity. Like, who are we as a group and how do we increase self-awareness across the group so that we can not only think about how we show up as individuals, as a team, but also even with clients. Like, how are we meeting clients? How do we strengthen that self-awareness? Beyond that, and then very much connected to it, I'm really interested in the idea of how we come into relationship with our own power. And by that, I mean, I'm interested in this idea of owning our own power. So how we own our power. And I think it's fair to say, like, we know that power dynamics exist in every relationship. But rather than ignoring them, which I think typically happens in businesses, I've rarely heard any leader or anyone across a business stand up and talk about their own power and what it looks like. Rather than doing that, we are interested in, cultivating an awareness of how power operates. So again, both within individuals and within systems so that we can own our power. And the approach that we kind of deploy with that moves beyond a traditional power over model. So I think it's very tempting for us to think about power as something we have over others. And instead, we work with businesses and teams to foster a power with approach, whereby it's about collaboration. It's about promoting the agency of the other and empowering the other without having to disempower ourselves. Power does not have to be something that is held individually, but it is something that I certainly feel has to be owned in order that we can think about what impact we have on others and therefore not risk being damaging or hurtful or worse, taking away their agency or power. So that's another key part. I guess a fourth thing, he's on a roll now, I'm off.
I love it. Love it.
A fourth thing as well that feels really, really important is I mentioned earlier that so much of what we do, it's not about giving advice. It's about facilitating someone else's process and supporting that. So in that sense, it really is about stimulating the growth of the other. And I'm amazed within businesses by how often, whether it's, again, like promotion pathways or like L&D, learning and development opportunities, are so structured from the perspective of the top. And often people who do not do your role do not actually know what skills are up and coming or would really push you forward or enable you to do different things that could be really helpful and financially lucrative for the business. It's very much a kind of top-down dictated sense of growth. But I think there is something, really valuable to learn from therapy in terms of therapy being a space in which we support people in discovering the most relevant and meaningful insights for themselves rather than leading or advising them. So there's something very design-led in that, I think, about kind of pushing an approach in which it includes rumbling with, again, the things that we might like to avoid sometimes, the stuff that is trickier.
Yeah.
But we do it with them. We walk alongside them is an expression that I like to use. And that process allows for much more authentic and sustainable transformation rather than just quick fix solutions when it comes to growth and development.
I love that. I love how you mentioned transformation because I'm a big believer in that rather than just lip service. And so in the spirit of transformation, how can or should businesses really make change happen?
I mean, this feels like the $1 million question. I've mentioned already, I really do think, across all people, most people struggle to ask for help. And I think there's something really integral here around recognizing what, especially as the leader of a business or, a manager within a business, what is yours to own and what feels appropriate versus where you actually need to ask for help and bring in other people. And I think that in that sense, yeah, there is such an important need here to be recognized around bringing in third parties, because partly it's about specialism and it's about having pretty niche or very qualified knowledge in how to do some of this work. But more than that as well, I would say, or certainly additionally, a lot of this work can't be done internally. And I say that on the basis that, so much of the time when you have specialists like this, they're either not actually at the top, they're not at the leadership level, they're somewhere within a hierarchy. There are egos aplenty at play, which is very natural. We all have an ego. And we're also all operating typically within a business in which it's a very ego-fueled system that kind of demands ego for, again, progression. So I think that, to actually have a third party come in that is operating out with the hierarchy, that isn't going to be subject to the same expectations around behavior or ways of working, or maybe, I want to say, some potentially silencing around difficult conversations.
Yes.
There is something incredibly important around that. Yeah. Sorry, were you going to say something?
Yeah, because so when you mentioned it can't be done internally as well, is part of it may also be like past negative experiences that employees have had and the lack of trust. So even if they do try and kind of make changes internally, because past experience has broken trust with the employees, then that third party can be a way of reestablishing that psychological safety that may be missing in that environment.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And as you're saying that, Yemi, it's making me think that there's also for me a bit of a need to challenge what has previously been done in terms of who has previously been asked to do this type of work. So as I say, I do think it is pretty specialist. And therefore, frankly, with the best will in the world, I think it's somewhat irresponsible to expect, say, a project manager to just treat this like a project, or even an innovation specialist to just think that this is a sprint. I've worked across a lot of businesses in which, say, transformation consultants are brought in or cultural specialists. And of course, there's a transformation element, there's a cultural element. But I think to have an absence of people who are specifically trained around emotional well-being and mental health support is negligent. I think that's an absolute need. And also, I think it needs to be said that this is not an HR issue. The reason I say that is largely because my experience of working across various businesses and with HR departments is that they are usually so stretched and so disempowered. This just is not in their wheelhouse. I don't think they often have scope to do this. And again, frankly, they are not qualified in supporting emotional and mental well-being. So in terms of that qualification piece, I think that whoever is brought in as a third party really needs to be able to explain exactly what they're doing and how they're doing it. And I would say that for me is a bit of a litmus test in terms of working out if they're the right person to be doing this job.
Wow, that was just phenomenal information. What do you think, Dulcie?
Yeah, I'm blown away. One thing I will add to that, bringing my own expertise to the table here. The question was, how should businesses really make change happen? There is actually a very simple answer. Can you get on the phone to Room for Therapy? Talk to them. Okay. Right? Just make your lives easier. Okay.
So, Phil, thank you so much. Like Dulcie said, before we let you go, can you tell us a little bit more about Room for Therapy? Let the people know.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, of course. And thank you for asking. So as I mentioned, we're an agency based in Edinburgh, but working nationally. And I think maybe what makes us a little bit different is we have a 3-part business model. So we offer one-to-one therapy within our private practice. And that's somewhat more traditional in some ways, although we are very much pushing a different model, a slightly more innovative model, we hope, of making it easier and more simple for people to engage with that and to maintain therapy. But then additionally, we have a second arm of the business, which is an outreach model. So that's about working with underserved communities and taking therapy out to spaces that maybe haven't had the benefit of it previously. But the third arm of the business, which I feel is particularly relevant to our discussion today, is the work that we do directly with businesses. And as I've been mentioning, that's very much about taking therapeutic principles and therapeutic practice into business spaces in order to support emotional, mental well-being, but also to just at times disrupt and question some systems that are in place in order that we can work towards better systems that enable a more empowering and agentic experience for employees.
Yeah, and that's the thing, Phil. You just mentioned more empowering, and an empowered workforce, right, leads to a healthy business. It's not like it's just for the employees themselves. There's a link, isn't there, between having an empowered, healthy workforce and the business outcomes.
Oh my goodness. I mean, so strongly, but to the point that when you really start to look into this and research this, as we have, as very much part of the work we do, it's kind of mind blowing. Like, it feels kind of mind blowing that there are such clear, even financial advantages to investing in the well-being of your employees. It's mind-boggling that it doesn't get done more. And for me, my genuine belief, because I do think that people are generally good, or all people have a capacity for goodness. I don't think it is coming from a place of malice or badness necessarily at all. I think we probably have a landscape of work at large in which people just don't really know how, or don't feel supported enough to try. And that's where we as Room for Therapy are really keen to support and to help them do things differently and to grow in every sense of that word.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today, for sharing your expertise. This has been, personally, and I'm sure for everybody listening, this has been such a valuable and powerful conversation.
Listen, thank you so much for having me on. It has been such a pleasure. And I'm just always delighted to talk to people who not only, see the importance in this work, but are willing to champion it as well, because it really is so important. And we spend so much of our time at work. It has to be a healthy experience.
Absolutely. And we'll include your details in the show notes, Phil, but please tell our listeners how to find you.
Sure thing. So if you are interested in exploring a little more of our one-to-one therapy offering, you can log onto our website at roomfortherapy.co.uk. And that is both an in-person and online therapy service. And if you'd like to follow us more generally and stay in tune with some of our myth-busting and various corporate works, follow us on Instagram at Room for Therapy. So that's room.for.therapy.
So, can't believe it. We've got to the end of season 1. We've really got here, and what a way to end the season. So, apart from thank you, Phil, for everything you've done today, I also want to thank all of our listeners for joining us on this journey. Your support has meant the absolute world to us, and we are so looking forward to bringing you more of this in season 2. And Phil, hopefully we'll get you back on as well.
Yes.
That would be great. Can't get rid of me.
Yes, Dulcie. And we've got something new. In season 2, we'll be introducing minisodes to answer your dilemmas. If you've got a burning work or life question, email us at dilemma@thisisworkwell.com. We'll anonymize your details and tackle your challenges with care and insight.
We sure will.
We've got you.
So don't forget to subscribe, and while you're there, leave a 5-star rating and review, and please feel free to share the podcast with someone that you think might find it helpful. You can connect with us on Instagram, on Threads, or on LinkedIn. We are at This Is WorkWell everywhere. So until next time, take care and keep working well.